May 1st, 1931, Midtown Manhattan. The air above 86th Street tasted of oil, coal smoke, and a thin, bitter tang of metal. At 1,250 feet up, the city was a far-off roar, and the sky was an endless, indifferent blue. On the exposed spine of the new tower, still raw, red with primer and rivet scorch, Aaron Sky Akwesasne stood with his toes curled over a flanged beam, the soles of his boots pressing into the cold bead of a weld, like a man testing ice. Below him, a lattice of scaffolding and tiny wagons of men crawled like ants. Above him, a gust sharpened to a knife. He smelled hot tar from the roof crews, the sweet iron of breeze-borne dust, and the faint citrus oil in the palm of the foreman who just clasped his shoulder. Aaron was neither a daredevil nor an exhibitionist. He was a precision craftsman with a lineage. He wore a battered wool shirt, suspenders strained over broad shoulders, and a cap turned backward against the wind. His tin lunch pail dangled from a hook on his belt. There was no safety harness anchored to a steel column, no net strung below the cathedral of girders. In its place was a braided leather lanyard at Aaron's hip, a tool tether, and a knot of braided rope in his pocket, used for hauling spare rivets, and, when necessary, a broom to sweep the grit off a beam. For equipment, he carried a 20-pound sledging hammer with a leather-wrapped handle, a rivet set, a hand drill, and a small leather pouch of chalk. On his left wrist, a battered pocket watch ticked like an indifferent judge. The gang boss, Patrick O'Leary, a man with an O that barked like a bell and a ledger for a mouth, barked orders from a lower brace. "Sky, we're set for the girder. Hoists at 3. He had a clipboard and a voice that cut through the wind. Beyond him, 2 slingers in orange kerchiefs signaled the derrick operator, who stared through his cab like a captain at the helm of a tiny ship, eyes narrowed against glare. Aaron's hands were steady because they'd been steady for years, knuckles scarred, palms a map of calluses. He had been taught on river barges and bridge jobs, on camps where the native men from the riverine communities of the St. Lawrence had first taken to ironwork. His father had walked beams for decades. His uncles had taught him how to judge a gust by the way a flag snapped, how to read a beam's flex by the hairline of a rivet, how to place a foot so the body and the steel spoke the same language. He listened to the steel, not with words, but with vibration. When a beam sang under his boots, it told him whether it was settled, whether the load was balanced. On the beam with him, a newcomer, Jimmy, red-handly, green-faced with fear and youth, clung to a temporary railing as if it were wood. His hands trembled. Aaron watched him, and in that look there was no scorn, only the flat assessment of a man whose life depended on another's steadiness. "Breathe, Jimmy. Watch the wind. Don't look down. Look at the beam." The words were as much an incantation as instruction. Aaron's voice did not raise. It landed. The crew needed him because today they were uniting the east and west cantilevers, a single girder, 4 tons, riding the hook. The rivet heaters on the ground were stoked to the precise glow, orange cores visible even from Aaron's height, and the rivet boys, faces flushed, were ready to ram. The hoist dropped the beam into place with the slings humming like a giant's harp. The operator nudged the load with millimeter patience. O'Leary signaled up, and Aaron stepped to the end of the beam, palm steady, one leg out to counterbalance. The city inhaled and exhaled through the steel. As the beam approached its seat, a gust slapped at Aaron's shirt like a living thing. It was not violent, just sudden, the kind of breath that could rearrange weight and will. He felt it in his knees first, a tiny tremor, then in his hands, an instinctive tightening on the rivet set. The beam was a living bridge between 2 halves of the Skyline, an artery every man below trusted with their lives. Aaron moved with the beam, not against it. A small sidestep, a hitch of his shoulder, a wink of the eye to the hoist operator, as if to say, "Ease." The beam kissed its seat. There are moments that sound like the hiss of a lighter, and others that explode like guns. Today, the moment was a chord, the hammering of the first rivet. The rivet boy's tongs presented a glowing hot slug. Aaron held the bucking bar, a blunt, rounded head counterweight that would form metal into obedience. He anticipated the time between the hammer's arc and the rivets flattening. "Now," O'Leary said. Jimmy steadied the temporary brace, and Aaron's arm moved like truth. The hammer met the rivet, and the metal collapsed into a seamless joint. For the men on the ground, the whole operation was a sequence of steps and signals. For Aaron, it was a ritual, ancient and private. The taste of the rivet's heat, the small shudder that traveled from wrist to elbow to shoulder when a hammer struck true, the sound of the steel answering like a bell. The rivet cooled, the first joint held, then the second. Jimmy's hands found rhythm, less tremor in each pass. The wind falling, the city's distant horns like a muted orchestra. Aaron felt something open inside him. Not pride, exactly, but the clean satisfaction of work done at the edge of danger. And still, there was that small, constant trust. No harness, no net, only the confidence in his feet, in the bond of years, and in the unspoken compact between men who had watched one another step into the void and come back. Around them, the skeleton of the building rose like an answer to a question no one had asked out loud. On that beam, suspended between sky and street, Aaron rolled a rivet into place, and the Skyline's future clicked one more time into certainty. Jimmy's grip firmed, and the final rivet in the joint cooled to a dull gunmetal gray. The wind paused, as if acknowledging the union. But Aaron Akwesasne's balance did not come from this one morning. It had been honed long before Manhattan ever learned his name. He had been born beside a river. Late autumn 1904, Kanawake Reserve, south of Montreal. The St. Lawrence River moved like hammered steel beneath a slate sky, ferry bells clanging in the mist. Young Aaron, barely 10, watched his father, Joseph Akwesasne, step off a barge wearing the same wool cap Aaron still wore decades later. Joseph walked with a peculiar grace of a man who measured height not in feet but in stories. In his duffel, a rivet hammer, 2 worn harness straps he refused to wear, and a tin of tobacco polished by years of pocket sweat. The scent of hot maple and wood smoke clung to the village. Children ran through dust and cedar chips, past the longhouse where elders debated council matters. But when a crew of returning ironworkers strode down the road, boots clacking like hooves, lunch pails swinging, every head turned. These were the Skywalkers, men who had built the Quebec Bridge before it fell into the river like a dying beast. Men who had gone back again after that collapse had swallowed 33 Mohawk lives. They carried that loss the way others carried heirlooms. At night, Aaron lay in bed, rolls still, listening. In the adjoining room, voices murmured over whiskey and pipe tobacco. One uncle said, "They say they'll build towers in New York taller than any church steeple." Another answered, "And they'll want men who don't freeze at height." "Men who don't look down," Joseph added. Aaron memorized the cadence. Fear? It was a luxury. Up on the iron, hesitation didn't just cost your life, it risked someone else's. Mohawk men had a word for that kind of responsibility. To Kenny Quaraton, to hold one another firmly, not out of sentiment, but survival. By 14, Aaron could tie a double bowline blindfolded. By 16, he could walk the ridge of a barn roof in a storm without flinching. By 18, he boarded a train south with half a dozen cousins, their tickets paid by an Irish subcontractor who knew exactly where to find the best high-steel workers. The train smelled of coal dust, boiled potatoes, and nervous bravado. New York was a thunderclap of noise. Streetcars shrieking, horses steaming in the gutters, vendors barking in every language. But overhead, what caught Aaron's eye wasn't the chaos on the ground.
It was the skeleton rising above it all, steel beams stretching upward like a ladder to some invisible realm. The city had never seen native men like these, silent, steady, boots already worn to the curvature of narrow beams. Headlines would eventually call them fearless, daredevils, crazy as foxes. But the truth was simpler. Precision born from generations of balance. Canoes on rapid waters, hunting trails on cliffs, winter roofs loaded in snow. The gangs quickly divided into tribes of their own. Italians sang as they slammed rivets. The Irish cursed like poets. The Poles prayed between each span. And then there were the Mohawks, few in number, light on chatter, moving like cats on the beams. There was rivalry in the air, sharp as ozone. One morning on the Empire State job site, an iron worker from Brooklyn spat tobacco over the edge and shouted across a girder, "Hey, Chief, you ain't got no coat today? Too lightheaded to feel the breeze?" Aaron turned his head slowly. His voice didn't rise. Coats are for men standing still. Laughter erupted, from both sides. Respect wasn't traded in compliments. It was bought with balance, and Aaron kept buying. By the late 1920s, he could read a Skyline the way others read scripture. He knew from the clang of a loose pen whether a beam was set wrong. He could see, by the way a man stepped onto iron, whether his fear lived in the knees or the gut. He was not the loudest, but when the hook came down with 4 tons of steel spinning in the wind, the foreman's voice always cut through the din with one command: let Sky place it. And he would. Step by deliberate step, he rose with each structure: the Woolworth, the Chrysler, bridges, spires, towers. Each one an altar, each one a test. Until one day, the job took him higher than any Mohawk before him. Until one day, the job took him higher than any Mohawk before him. August 12, 1930. Early morning haze clung to Midtown like wet cotton, muffling the yawns of trucks and the clank of chain hoists. Aaron Sky Akwesasne stood 1,000 feet above 34th Street, on what would soon become the crown of the Empire State Building. The steel beneath his boots vibrated with the restless hunger of a city watching itself grow by the hour. Below, men swarmed like silverfish around carts of rivets. Above, hawks circled as if curious why humans insisted on stealing their air. The hoist bell clanged twice. Beam incoming. 2 connectors, one Irish and one Mohawk, stood ready at opposite ends of the span. Aaron was dead center, knees bent, toes gripping the narrow web like talons. His left hand held a podger wrench, his right coiled loosely at his side. His cat brim fluttered in the updraft like a torn feather. The derrick operator eased the girder into view, a 40-foot length swinging from cables, its weight turning lazily in the morning wind. It glinted like a sword being drawn. One misalignment, and it would smash into the frame with enough force to shear bolts and snap cables. Or worse, take a man with it. He heard the Irishman, Seamus O'Malley, grumble across the void. "She's dancing today." "She'll settle," Aaron murmured. But then something went wrong. The hook snagged on a secondary cable. Instead of slowing, the beam lurched, sudden, violent, like a bull ripping free from a post. Men shouted. The wind screamed against flanges. The girder swung wide, right toward Aaron. Instinct, not thought, drove him. His foot slid to the beam's edge. His torso leaned with the incoming strike, not away. His right hand shot out, palm slamming flat onto freezing steel. Momentum shoved him backwards, boots skidding. His heel kissed open air. For a split second, he was suspended between gravity and will. No harness, no net, just fingers clawing into rust and a heartbeat louder than the city below. Then, contact. The beam's end wedged against the seated bracket with a resonant clang, inches from where his chest had been. O'Malley was swearing prayers in Irish. Someone below dropped a hammer that clattered down half a dozen levels. The derrick operator froze, guilt and panic painted on his face. But Aaron didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't move. He laughed. Low, gravelly, disbelieving. He patted the steel like one pats a stubborn mule. "See? Told you she'd settle." The tension snapped like overstretched wire. Men exhaled. Someone shouted, "Sky's flirting with death again." O'Malley called back, "Next time buy her dinner first." Even the derrick operator managed a shaky salute. Yet that moment left its mark. Later, kneeling to bolt the girder, Aaron noticed his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from anger. Not at the beam, not at fate, but at sloppiness. He didn't blame the machine. He blamed the small lapse, the lazy cable check, the wind misjudged. Up here, precision wasn't a preference, it was law. That night, sitting on the edge of the structure with his lunch pail open, Aaron watched the lights of Manhattan flicker to life like a bed of coals being stoked. He spoke quietly to no one. One loose hook, one lazy knot. That's all it takes. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and carved words into the inside lid of his tin. Steady, or die. It was not a warning. It was a creed. It was not a warning. It was a creed. The next morning arrived not with sunlight, but with fog, thick, muffling, turning the steel skeleton into a floating ghost above Manhattan. Visibility was barely 20 feet in any direction. Below, horns groaned like ships lost at sea. Up here, the world was reduced to breath, metal, and memory. The foreman hesitated to start the shift. "Can't see your own boots," O'Leary muttered. "Might as well be blindfolded." But Aaron strapped on his tool belt and stepped forward. "Steel's still where we left it." The others followed, not because they were fearless, but because no one wanted Sky walking out there alone. The fog swallowed them as they moved onto the span. Each footstep rang against the beam like sonar. Every clang echoed into nothing. In these conditions, a misjudged step could mean instant disappearance. A slip, and you'd be gone before anyone heard you fall. That's when the Mohawk chant began. It wasn't planned. It wasn't loud. It started as a hum in Aaron's chest, a rhythm older than rivets, a river song, the kind sung while paddling against the current, a deep, steady hona, hona, hona. O'Malley joined with a low whistle. Then Sal the Italian snapped his fingers to the beat. Someone slapped a wrench rhythmically against the column. The fog thinned, not physically, but in spirit. The beam became less like a threat and more like a hallway. The men moved as one. Tools passed hand to hand without sight. Rivets thrown from heated acacia with perfect timing, landing with a hiss into awaiting buckets. The hammer blows struck like drum beats, sharp, sure, defiant. There were bonds forged in conversation, in handshake, in pact. And then there are bonds forged in silence, on steel where death is a hair away, and the only thing keeping you alive is the timing of another man's hand. That day, a legend was sealed not by newspaper photographers or ground-level admirers, but in mist and grit where no one else could see it. Hours later, when the fog finally lifted, the crew stood blinking in the sudden blaze of sun. A full section of the span had been secured, rivets lined in perfect rows like soldiers standing at attention. O'Leary stared at the work, then at the crew. He spat, nodded once, and grinned. "You boys lay iron like priests building altars." Sal clapped Aaron's shoulder. More like surgeons stitching up the sky. Aaron said nothing. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist and glanced down at the city below, now visible again, unaware of how close the invisible had come to swallowing its builders. Later that day, during lunch break, the men gathered on a crossbeam, eating sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, legs dangling over the void. O'Malley broke a pickle in half and tossed one piece to Aaron. "You ever get tired of saving our hides, Sky?" Aaron shrugged. "You ever get tired of needing me too?" Laughter erupted, echoing down the frame like bells. But beneath the jokes, everyone knew the unspoken hierarchy. Foremen gave orders, engineers drew plans, but up on the steel, there was one rule that superseded all others. When Sky moved, everyone matched his rhythm. He was not the loudest voice, nor the fastest climber, but he was the tempo, the tuning fork, the man whose heartbeat set the pace of the entire crew. And one day soon, that pace would be tested beyond anything they had yet to face. January 22nd, 1931. Before sunrise, ice crackled beneath boots as Aaron Sky Akwesasne climbed the final ladder to the pinnacle of the Empire State's crown. Snow flurried sideways, stinging skin like needles. The wind had no direction. It came from everywhere at once, a swirling animal snarling between beams. This wasn't like the warm spring mornings when the city watched in awe. The newspapers called this phase the race to the sky. But the men up here knew the truth. Winter didn't care about headlines. They were down to a skeleton of a crew, only those steady enough, stubborn enough, and mad enough to finish what they had started. No tourists, no gawkers, just steel, storm, and resolve. Aaron's gloved hand gripped the icy flange as he hauled himself onto the topmost girder, where only the spire remained to be secured. Far below, the city was invisible beneath clouds. There was no Manhattan, no Earth, just void. O'Malley was already there, cheeks red, frost crusting his mustache. "Thought you'd sleep in," Aaron snorted. "The wind was knocking on my window. Figured it wanted company." Sal clambered behind them, teeth chattering. "Let's bolt this thing before my hands turn to glass." The task? Locked the final girder of the upper mast, while the derrick swung a section of antenna into place above them. No firm footing, no guardrails, no room for hesitation. The spire section, 20 feet long and gleaming like a frozen spear, descended toward them. It twisted in the gale, cables shuddering under strain. Aaron planted his boots in a split stance, one foot braced against a vertical strut, the other pressing into the narrow beam. The cold burned through leather. His breath crystallized in the air. He raised both arms. "Bring her down!" The derrick operator, a figure barely visible through blowing snow, lowered with surgical slowness. The spire hung above Aaron's head like the fang of a god. A stronger gust hit. The spire swung wide, its tip slicing through the air toward Sal. Aaron moved before thought. His arm shot out, forearms slamming into Sal's chest, yanking him down flat to the beam. The spire passed inches above their heads, shrieking like metal lightning. "Jesus, Mary, Joseph!" Sal gasped. Aaron didn't answer. He was back up, fingers clamped around the guide rope. He leaned his full weight, body parallel to the void, muscles straining as he wrestled the spire back into alignment. O'Malley hammered the pin into place the moment the base met the socket. One slam. 2, 3. The connection held. They breathed. Not relief,
Not yet, but agreement. Now came the rivets. The heater boy, stationed 2 levels down, flung rivets up with tongs, each one a blazing comet through the snow, glowing molten red amid the white chaos. Aaron caught one clean in the bucket, slapped it into the hole, spun the bucking bar behind. O'Malley's hammer struck. Clang, clang, clang. Every blow echoed into the frozen sky like cannon fire. Again, again, again. The final rivet sealed. The Empire State's crown was born. For a moment, there was no wind, no storm, just silence. Aaron rested his glove against the steel. His breath slowed. O'Malley exhaled with a grin. "Well, Sky, reckon that's about as high as they'll let us build." Aaron shook his head, gaze lifted toward the clouds above. "They'll go higher, but not without men like us. They'll go higher, but not without men like us." The storm cleared by afternoon. The city slowly emerged beneath them, first as a smear of light, then as streets, then as people. Tiny, unaware, but alive because of the work of hands they would never meet. Reporters on the ground would soon cheer headlines like "Empire State Crowned in Storm Triumph," but none of them would print the truth. The final 12 feet were set not by machines or magnates, but by men without harnesses, without nets, without fanfare. A quiet brotherhood on a beam. Aaron Sky Akwesasne descended the steel like a man retracing his own lineage. At each level he passed, he saw footprints, faint, dusty impressions left by hundreds of men who climbed these ribs every morning without knowing if they'd come down alive. Some wore hobnailed boots, some smooth leather, some moccasins. Many had never been recorded in ledgers. Most would never be named in plaques. But the steel remembered. At the 80th floor, he paused beside a column where someone had etched initials with a bolt tip, J.A., 1929. He ran a glove over it. Joseph Akwesasne, his father. Beside it, newer scratches shimmered beneath frost. A.A., 1931. He smiled, not proud, not humble, just aligned, as if 2 eras had shaken hands. Years rolled like rivets down a chute. Other towers rose. Other crews climbed. But no skyline in America would ever rise again without Mohawk Ironworkers among its ranks. From Rockefeller Center to the World Trade Center, anywhere there was steel-kissing sky, there were men from Kanewake, Akwesasne, and 6 Nations walking its bones. Photographers would later snap iconic black and white images. 11 men eating lunch, perched on a girder, legs swinging above the void. Newspapers would call them daredevils, fearless tribesmen, sky warriors. But ask any Mohawk elder and he'll tell you, they weren't fearless. They were focused. They didn't tempt fate. They trusted their feet. And when they walked the beams without harnesses, it wasn't recklessness. It was calculation. A rope could snag. A net could give false comfort. But balance? Balance was eternal. Aaron never wrote memoirs, never sat for interviews. He retired with fingers crooked from hammer blows and knees that creaked like old bridge joints. Some nights, when the wind rattled the walls of his cabin near the St. Lawrence, he would rise, step outside into the cold, and stare southward, toward where those towers lived on the horizon. He would feel the phantom weight of a rivet hammer in his fist.
He would feel the wind tugging at his shirt, and in his bones he would hear the heartbeat of steel. Clang, clang, clang. Some say that when the fog rolls over Manhattan just right, you can hear humming on the beams, a low chant, steady as a pulse. Others swear they've seen silhouettes walking along rooftops where no paths exist. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's footprints that refused to fade. For the city of New York, the skyline was a symbol. For Aaron Akwesasne and his people, it was a handshake between earth and sky. And they were the ones who brokered the deal.